Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. 3 novels. The Treatment by Michael Nath, Georges Perec's 53 Days, and Enrique Vila-Matas, who's from Spain, Mack and His Problem, which is translated by Margaret Costa and Sophie Hughes, and the Perec is translated by David Bellos. I'm going to start with Treatment by Michael Nath. So the background for this book is the most infamous case of racist murder in the UK in 1993, where 2 Afro-American kids were at a bus stop waiting for their bus when a racist gang of 5 white youths happened along them and stabbed them, and one of the Afro-American youths died. And it took basically, I don't know, 15 to 20 years for them to be, for someone to be charged, brought to trial. And of the 5, only 2 were brought to trial. And although they were sentenced, as far as I know, the other 3 have never been brought to justice, even though everyone knows their names and who they are. And in that intervening period of 20 years, there was a sort of smear campaign against the dead boys' parents because they were agitating, claiming that the police were doing nothing because of institutional racism in the police and or corruption, that someone was sort of clamping down on any kind of proper investigation. So that's the backdrop. And yet, what annoyed me about this book is it really is only a sort of an excuse as a backdrop. This is set 20 years later. The theme of it is that there's still, I mean, all the names have been changed, but that there is still institutional corruption in the police, which I'm sure there probably is. But it's not really about institutional racism when this is set. Instead, we get this sort of rather Dickensian gang of people who have been wronged by the fictional power behind the white racist gang in here. That there was a 6th member who was never named, and he was protected by someone with a lot of clout who basically had the ability to sort of pull strings within local government and stuff. And that this sort of gaggle of characters of diverse race and gender and sexuality and all this stuff have all got their own personal reasons for wanting revenge on this 6th member. And the journalist narrator through this, who has got his eye on the power behind the throne, bringing him down for his corruption. I have to say, it's written with sort of brio. The language is fantastic. It's very much almost all dialogue or reported dialogue. There's very little description. And it does cast up an image of London. It's very much a sort of street London of lowlights and beggars and gangsters and people on the fringes and on the margins. And as I say, it's a bit Dickensian, really. It's Dickensian, I think, in its brio. It's Dickensian in its portrait of street life. I say Dickensian, I mean modern Dickensian, obviously. It's Dickensian in its sort of portrayal of, you know, as I say, it's sort of a revenger's tale, but, you know, sort of part of it is sort of pointing out the sort of corruption of high power and things like that. But it's unconvincing. It's unconvincing because I felt that the original racist crime, which is at the back of this, is not dealt with in any way. That this is really about the personal agendas of the motley crew against the people they're up against. It makes, you know, there's no analysis or there's no bringing forward of the events of 20 years ago into this, really. I mean, it's there, but it's not analysed. Most of the characters are not Afro-Caribbeans. There's not actually that much about race in here. It's much more about gender, sexuality, and sort of class rather than race. So I found it very unsatisfying, although, as I say, the brio made it an enjoyable read. But at the end of it, I sort of thought, so what, really? It also reminded me of China Miéville's Kraken in its treatment of London and London street life, although Miéville employs lots of fantasy and urban fantasy elements. This isn't. This is a straight treatment. But And I didn't like Kraken either. So yeah, I give this three stars. I have to say it might have got 4 stars, but the ending did what Ian McEwan's Solar did, where this sort of rather extended cast of characters are all transported from London to Spain for the final showdown. And that is utterly contrived. There's no reason other than the fact the book starts with the 2 main characters being on holiday in Spain, and they go back there at the end, and then all these people on their tails, both to protect them or to, you know, come to a reckoning with them, are all transported over to their holiday place. Yeah, I mean, I really dislike that. So yeah, 3 stars. And on to Mack and His Problem, which was recommended to me, or not recommended, it was brought to my notice by Zena over at BT Around the Books. I say not recommended because she hasn't read it yet. I'd never heard of this book, but I can see entirely why she recommended it to me. It's sort of postmodern metafiction, but it's very good. So it starts off with the main character, who is a lawyer, although he disguises that fact and tells the reader that he owned a factory and that the factory had to be closed, so that he's sort of thrown into unemployment. And having been a prodigious reader all his life, he feels that he's going to try his hand at writing. But he wants to sort of ease into it, that even though his dream is to write the great unfinished interrupted novel, a novel interrupted by death, but it will be faked, you know, he won't really have died. But he realises he's got to break his way in slowly, so he starts off by keeping a diary, which means that he's very concerned for it not to be novelistic, for it to remain a faithful record of his encounters, you know, during the day in Barcelona, with again a weird and wonderful group of characters, including a neighbour called Sanchez, who is a writer, published author. And Sanchez and he get into conversation about one of Sanchez's books, which Sanchez described as a sort of youthful folly, that he hadn't really learned his craft, and you know, he sort of dismisses his own book. And the character here decides actually he was going to rewrite that book. That's what his, once he's sort of got into the swing of writing through his diary, that's going to be his next project, which is a rewriting of this book, even though its author has disowned it, effectively. And this book is made up of not short stories, because the central character remains the same through all of them. The central character is a ventriloquist, which is an intriguing image in itself, because it's, you know, throwing your voice, which is kind of one of the things that this book examines, is whose voice does the author speak with when he creates characters. And this ventriloquist has, you know, sort of 8 or 9 incidents that are portrayed here, each in a different style from a different writer, from Borges. I need to look up who the other writers that he parodies. Barnes, Junior Barnes. I'll not be able to find it, but several, and each chapter is preceded by a epigram from the author that is being not parodied so much. So one of the things as he goes through, so we get this sort of fiction of these stories analysed by the writers. He's reading them, but obviously the author Vila-Matas is creating them for us, the reader. So we're a sort of second set of eyes at one remove from the main character, and it's an ingenious sort of setup really, about this ventriloquist. I mean, I really enjoyed as the narrator was taking us through, as if we were reading that book rather than this book. And then we start getting the narrator's take on these stories, how he was thinking of rewriting them. And he's going to change every single epigram to another author, which means he was going to change the style of every single. So I enjoyed all of that. I thought that was great. That got us to about halfway through the book. And in between that, we get lots of stuff about his sort of daily ramblings, because he's not working in Barcelona, and his concerns not to fictionalise these increasingly strange and bizarre happenings that he encounters. He gets sort of increasingly idée fixée that his wife is having an affair with Sanchez. There's this guy who is Sanchez's nephew, purportedly, who's so critical of Sanchez, hates his work, his uncle's work, reckons he's the best author in the world that the world has never seen. So all this sort of is bubbling along. But I felt that when he sort of pretty much stopped talking about this imaginary book about the ventriloquist, the novel somewhat lost its focus, really. There are themes of also creativity and rebellion, how when we're young that we imagine that we're going to change the world, but then we settle for a sort of conservative suburban life, and how this strikes is the same in art, where the young artists think they're going to iconoclastically overthrow all that's come before, but all they really introduce is a critique genre, which then becomes its own convention to be overthrown in the future. So it does sort of consider those things, but it's a bit of a sort of a hodgepodge of ideas. I think it does hold together. I just think some of those ideas were less interesting than others, but I give it 4 out of 5 because it was highly enjoyable. And I will say that he name checks David Markson, which always gets a tick for me. There are a lot of call-outs to other writers as part of his analysis of these books, of this book about the ventriloquist and his own thoughts from his own prodigious reading. But another book that he calls out is this, which I'd never heard of. This is Georges Perec's 53 Days. I've previously read 3 Perec novels, and they've increasingly bowled me over. Each one I've read has sort of taken me onto a new admiration for Perec. Now, the first thing to say is that I had to look long and hard on Amazon UK to find this. It's buried after all the sort of French versions. It's on about page 4 or 5 of Perec's listed works. This is his last work. He died at age 45 of lung cancer, very young. And this is supposedly unfinished because he died before he could complete it. But the point made in here, and one which I think absolutely holds, is no, Perec did finish this. The way it's structured, the way it's set up, is it's been deliberately fabricated to look as though it was unfinished, to look as though death had interrupted. And that his 2 Aleppo author mates, who are Jacques Rubard and Henry Matthews, who wrote Sleuth, which I read this year and hated, but anyway, they completed it from supposedly binders and notes found after his death. I think that's all part of the artifice, and that's the genius of this book, that it is, in a way, it's a fuck you to death. It's like Perec going, yeah, well, I know I'm going to die, it's lung cancer, it's inoperable, I'm going to finish this book as a fuck you to death, I'm going to beat death's scythe, but I'm going to make it look as though I didn't. And it's an extraordinary piece of work. So, to begin with, it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is set in an African dictatorship, which is a former French colony, which the French still have lots of interests and settlers there. And a author who lives out there called Robert Serval has disappeared. Now, before he disappeared, he felt under threat, and he consigned his manuscript, unfinished at that point, to the consul, the French consul, with strict instructions that if anything did happen to him, the consul was to give this manuscript to a local high school teacher who's a French settler, and that the reasons for his fate, whatever it would be located in this manuscript. So it's narrated from the point of view of this high school teacher, whose name we don't know. And as he reads the manuscript and reads it to us in similar fashion to the ventriloquist, the story about the ventriloquist in here, he is solving the puzzle of why has this been left to him? What has happened to Serval? And the first thing to say is it's a detective mystery. It's not autobiographical, this manuscript, although the detective in it is called Robert Serval, same name as the author. And the teacher takes us through his sort of workings of cracking the secret ciphers and the clues that are in the manuscript to try and work out what's happened to Serval. And I'm not going to spoil any more about the first part because it's a detective thriller, and if I'd sort of told you where it ends up, it would definitely be a spoiler. But it's a highly ingenious, and the unravelling of the codes and things are very entertaining, very enjoyable. They're mainly revolving around names of people. And you begin to realise that this is typical of the Aleppo movement of constrained writing, of having certain words that you have to use. In this case, it's names which have literary associations from other people's books. So that is the first part, and it's 13 chapters long. There's supposedly, I think, 2 more chapters that Perec didn't finish, but no, it's self-contained, it works. Then we go on to the second part, which is a fake exegesis of part 1, saying all of that was a sort of grand metaphor and encryption of a true life event, which is a traitor betraying the Maquis, the French resistance during the Second World War, so that British commandos and French Maquis resistance fighters were caught by the Germans and either killed in a shootout or handed over to the Gestapo to be tortured. And the thing is trying to work out who that traitor is. They all had code names in the Maquis, and there's a character called Robert Serval in part 2, who was not this writer in a former French colony, because that was fictional. Here he's portrayed as someone who actually served in the French government, also disappears, and in his abandoned car is found a manuscript which is making the link between the manuscript referred to in part 1 and this story of the French resistance being betrayed. And again, there's all sorts of sort of allusions and codes and things like that. And what Perec is serving us up, and even more so in part 3, which are the supposed notes and ring binders found by his mates and put into part 3 to, of the unfinished, the bits that were not written by Perec, that were left unfinished, but in my mind were absolutely finished. Perec gives you the sources, the literary sources, particularly Stendhal. 53 Days was either the name of a Stendhal book, or he'd been challenged to write a book in 53 days, or challenged himself. So it's a lot of literary reference to Stendhal. So Perec is revealing his literary sources. He's also revealing his method, because there are things like how he weaves in Fibonacci sequences into the coding. There are sketches, so you get how he thinks visually. All of that is laid out in these notes, which supposedly are there to finish the story that he didn't finish. But actually, I think they lay bare the story. They give us the constrained words. So we've worked backwards from the words being in the text in part 1 and then part 2 to here in part 3 of the notes as to where those constrained words came from. And it's just ingenious. It's so subversive. And, it's a lot about mirrors and false identities and people stealing identities, people being not being what they seem, all that sort of stuff. That's why I think, this book, A, is genius because of it's a labyrinth of false leads. Even the, part 2 is a fake exegesis of part 1. Part 1 is only ever presented as a work of fiction. That you never get to the bottom of reality in this book, because it's just refractions and refractions and refractions and reflections and reflections and reflections. And that's why, I don't know if you saw Brian over at Bookish did a response to my video, and I'll post the links to both of ours, I did a video called What is Fiction For?, in which I suggested fiction isn't for anything beyond entertainment. It has nothing to do with the real world. It only tells us about fiction, because all novels are in conversation with all previous novels. And this book, to me, is a living, breathing, albeit Perec's dead, example of that. There's nothing about reality other than the fact that reality cannot even be broached in fiction, if there is even such a thing as reality. This is purely a novel speaking to previous novels, Stendhal, the pulp fiction, detective novels that are tracked down by the high school teacher that feed into the first part of this book. So this is just wonderful. 5 stars, 5 stars plus. Definitely get to my top 10. And as I say, I started with his novel A Void. Then I read probably his best known book, which is Life a User's Manual. Then I read W, or the Memory of Childhood, and each one progressively was a better read than its predecessor, and this continues that. As good as W, or the Story of Child, Story of Childhood, I think, 5 stars. This is even better than that, and of those 4 books, I've given 3 of them 5 stars. This is just wonderful, such a wonderfully subversive, a novel for the sake of only being a novel, and the great cosmic trick that I believe Perec plays on all of us by writing a book that looks as though that it was unfinished, it was sort of put together in the end by his fellow author friends, but actually no, I think they were in on it. I mean, I have no way of substantiating this. I'm just going on the clue that book gave me. And I rode it all the way in my passage through this book, thinking, yeah, absolutely. Perec finished this book, left it to suggest that it was something else, as part of this whole thing about leaving behind red herrings and false leads. And yeah, it's just brilliant. So it's a book about crime and metaphysics, or crime as metaphysics, and fiction writing as metaphysics, as is this, but this is just on another level altogether. So I'm so glad I read these back to back, because they complemented each other perfectly and probably enhanced my appreciation of this. So there you have it. That's my recent reads for mid-September. Highly successful. Thanks very much. Till next time.